Thank you, everybody, for attending the lecture here today. Before I get underway, I just want to thank the Grand Lodge of Canada and the Province of Ontario for hosting this lecture, and for very much I want to thank them for being involved in the academic life of Brock University. There is really a deep need for more active involvement in the academic study of Freemasonry. It's a growing area, but it certainly needs more attention these days. I'd also like to welcome the most worshipful, the Grand Master, all right worshipful and very worshipful brethren all. I'd like to welcome all faculty, especially the faculty of Brock University, and all students who are here studying Freemasonry today. And certainly I'd like to welcome everybody else. Now, my lecture today is entitled A Tale of Two Lodges, Weberian Types and an Analytic Model of Canadian Masonic Involvement in the 21st Century. Now, let me just introduce my interest in this area. I've been a Freemason now for almost 23 years, and I've seen a lot of change, a lot of things that happen, and a lot of ferment in Freemasonry in that time. And, Freemasonry did get a fair bit of attention sort of around the turn of the century, in the first decade or so of the century. And there was a lot of intention in popular culture. We saw the Da Vinci Code, we saw National Treasure, we saw lots of sort of pop cultural attention to Freemasonry, but we also see an uptick in academic attention. But one thing I found, because when I joined Masonry, I'm a sociologist, but I'm also a Freemason. I have a lot of interest in things that surround Freemasonry. And what I found after digging into a lot of material is that the stuff in popular culture tends to play to a lot of stereotypes that are out there about Freemasonry, mostly for public consumption, to some extent titillation. Whereas the academic focus tends to be very, very much on the past. It focuses on history. It focuses on what Masons have done historically. It talks about the history of Grand Lodges and so on. There's a lot of attending to philological matters too. Focus on the meaning of words and terms and so on at certain points. But what I found is the focus tended to be very backward, tend to look backward in time. And to the limited extent that there's a sociological focus, it's also very much focused on the past. It tends to focus on the role of the craft in social history. And I noticed that there was a real gap here that was largely missing. It was the study of the contemporary meaning of participation in Freemasonry for the members themselves. So I decided I would dig into this. And basically, I try to, in my book, address this theoretical and empirical neglect, and try to shed some light on Masonry today from a sociological standpoint. And so what I've tried to do in my book is I try to look at Masonry in relation to contemporary society from a variety of different angles. I talk about what attracts people to the craft. I talk about their experience going through the degrees. I talk about their the various changes in their lives that they've claimed to have occurred since they became Masons. But I also spend a fair bit of time talking about this issue of involvement. And and one thing I will say at the very outset here is that I didn't set out to focus on this issue quite as heavily as I have, but this is what came out of the material. This is emergent data, and people wanted to talk about the issue of involvement perhaps more than they wanted to talk about anything else. So I had to literally spend 3 whole chapters in my book addressing this issue, which I realized was very, very complex. Okay, so let's turn to the problem now. Once candidates have been attracted to Freemasonry, and they've gone through the various ceremonies of initiation, passing, and raising to become a Master Mason, the question is, well, what now? New members are certainly free to participate in the ceremonies, the business, and the charity work of the lodge to the extent that they so desire and that opportunities are available. But again, why would they do this? What encourages brethren to want to participate, and what facilitates their ongoing involvement in the lodge and its various activities? Conversely, what discourages them? What fosters attrition in the Masonic ranks? Well, in the opening decades of the 21st century, one thing that I've heard over and over again in Masonic circles is that it's not just getting them in, it's keeping them. So what I'm trying to do today then is to empirically address this critical question that faces Masonry today. Well, there's been research on this, much of it going on from within the Masonic community, and research on this issue has not been encouraging. Uh, so John Belt, a quantitative study of a sample of lodges throughout the English-speaking world, noted rapidly decreasing periods of time from initiation to a member's resignation or exclusion, that is, deaths excluded, during the latter half of the 20th century. The average duration of membership in the lodge went from more than 20 years until about the 50s, and it dropped to about approximately 10 years on average by the 70s, and then fell to roughly between 4 and 6 years of involvement by the early 90s. Other statistical analysis of Masonic membership highlight the significance of this issue, suggesting that the craft currently faces a serious crisis in retention of members. So even if there's been an increase in initiations in the first part of the 21st century, which did seem to happen in some places, when we contrast that with the shortening duration of member involvement, as well as ongoing deaths of many older members, this picture is not good. It doesn't bode well for the future of an organization that, despite massive population growth in society, is already at its lowest membership in close to 100 years. Getting a handle on the issue of member involvement is very important then for the survival of the craft. Now, the Masonic membership Grand Lodges are well aware of this issue. So the Masonic Service Association, starting in 2004, put together a program called It's About Time, detailing a lot of significant matters related to the decline of involvement, and also articulating specific issues that should be considered in improving member retention. Similarly, many Grand Lodges have put together membership development programs, such as those found in the Grand Lodge of California, or for that matter, the widely distributed 10 Steps to Lodge Renewal, developed by the Grand Lodge of Iowa. Including in these broader programs is one widely adopted strategy whereby Grand Lodges put together what they call mentorship programs, whereby individual lodges assign mentors to new members to maintain social contact, answer questions, to encourage participation, and so on. And in fact, the two Grand Lodges that I'm going to be talking about in this presentation today, that is the Grand Lodge of Nova Scotia and the Grand Lodge of Newfoundland and Labrador, each of them have adopted this kind of approach. Yet, despite the uneven implementation of these strategies, the retentional problem still remains an organizational priority. So it's imperative at this point to really move beyond the membership numbers and look at qualitative data from contemporary Freemasons, to see what they themselves experience and what their experiences can, the light it can shine on this important issue. So what did I do in going about this study? Well, the data from my book comes primarily from three sources. First of all, there's video footage shot for a feature film on contemporary Freemasonry. This is a film called Inside Freemasonry. It came out in 2003. And in fact, it was produced by a brother in my mother lodge in Halifax, who happens to be a film producer. And I know about the movie because I was in it, along with a lot of other people I knew. And at a certain point, when I started investigating Masonry, I called him up and I said, "You still have the video footage?" He says, "Yeah, do you want it?" And he gives me a banker's box full of 58 videotapes, and it has interviews and information on 27 different Masons. And I coded this in qualitative analysis software and set it up for the analysis. I also, over the course of a year or so, did interviews with 121 Freemasons in Nova Scotia and in Newfoundland. There were 72 brethren I interviewed in Nova Scotia, and there were 49 in Newfoundland. And then finally, in addition to these interview and film data that I had, I also checked everything, the conclusions that I was working up through qualitative analysis of all of these quite extensive interviews. I checked it against my own observations and experiences in, well over 2 decades as a practicing Freemason in both jurisdictions. And I would, and sometimes I would speak to people who were well placed, just say, is this what I'm, am I right about this? And sometimes I'd get some good feedback. So I cross-checked all this information, I coded it in qualitative analysis software, and I basically looked at various themes, any kind of hypothesis I came up with, I would do negative case testing, basically till I get to the point that I didn't seem to be finding anything new. So that's basically how I went about doing this, and trust me, it was quite a long process. So what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about what I'm doing. Well, what I'm doing here is the men I talked to had a lot to say about the current state of Freemasonry, and much of it revolved around, one way or another, around this issue of involvement. And this is whether in relation to new, recently minted Master Masons, or in relation to re-engaging brethren who hadn't been heard from for some time. Some respects, their comments related to what they liked and what they didn't like about the Masonic order. Or in some cases in relation to their own lodge in particular. But a lot of these men went a lot deeper than this. From the tenor and detail of their comments, it was clear that many had in fact spent some time thinking about the desirability of maintaining the Masonic order, or even their own lodge, into the future. As I said, the people talked about involvement more than anything else. It jumped out at me as opposed to something that I is going to be focusing on quite so heavily. So I think it's important to see what many of these men who had thought a lot about this had to say. So what I try to do here when I, more or less try to organize all this data, I follow the approach of classical sociologist Max Weber. And I talk about the various involvement factors that emerged in my data to try to outline an ideal series of polar opposites for analytic purposes. At one extreme here would be what one would think of as the ideal lodge that would facilitate long-term involvement of its members. At the other extreme is a lodge that doesn't do a lot to keep people there. It actually encourages the relatively quick exit of any members that may join it. So I'm looking at the ideal lodge to foster involvement, and the lodge that is basically its polar opposite, that will encourage quick exit of its members. And while certainly these are extremes drawn for analytic purposes, and any real lodge will undoubtedly fit somewhere between these two poles on a continuum, this analytic exercise, enables us to represent in a more clear fashion the elements critical to Masonic involvement today. So what I'm going to do is talk about the broad themes that are jumped out of my data. And the people's comments about involvement fell into 6 broad categories or themes. That is social atmosphere, organizational features, educational issues, the impact of other people's other involvements or commitments that may make it difficult for them to spend a lot of time in being engaged with Masonry. I'll talk about some of the moral and ethical issues that people commented on that related to involvement. And lastly, some people talked about motivation, and what motivated them to get into the lodge, what motivates them to stay, and it's not always the same thing. So these are the 6 broad categories that I'm going to be speaking about today. Just in terms of how common these were, the most significant concerns were the first 2. Social atmosphere and organizational issues. These together amounted to 65% of the comments on involvement, 31 and 34% respectively. These were followed in terms of frequency that they were mentioned by education at 20%, people's other involvements and commitments at 10, issues about morality at 3, and finally comments about motivation at 2. And all of these themes are fairly complex. They serve as headings or umbrellas that sheltered, in many cases, a diversity of sub-themes apiece that testify both to the relative complexity of the issues and their significance to the overall issue of involvement. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to essentially unpack some of these broad themes just to give you a flavor for what people were saying. And I can assure you that there's a lot more that can be said about each one of these, but given the time we have, I'll just have to hit the highest of high points, and then maybe perhaps we can delve into them a little bit more in the questions. Okay, so as I said, one of the broadest, most common themes here was the issue of social atmosphere. So here's some of the things that we can say encourages long-term involvement, according to the brethren I interviewed. First of all, there was talk about how well people fit into the lodge. Did they fit into this group in some way or another? And from people's comments, it came out that there needed to be a good fit between members' prior background and the social atmosphere that existed in a given lodge. And this involves a number of different things. It involves sufficient similarity between members' prior interests and what goes on. And what goes on in the lodge. So there needs to be some correspondence there. There was a lot of talk about the lodge as being a sanctuary or a haven or a safe space that people could go to kind of get away from things. In many ways, it is seen as offsetting the stresses and strains of people's day-to-day lives and concerns. But it also had to, in some ways, people spoke to how it seemed to be a place of stability or something solid they could rest on, as opposed to the way that the world is so chaotic today, and how there's so little meaning, and how things are uncertain and so on. This seemed to be a real selling point for people. But beyond those sorts of things, there needed to be, in many ways, the group needed to be relevant, both with regard to people's stresses and strains, their day-to-day concerns, their prior interests, and essentially you needed to remain relevant in all of these areas to come up with a fruitful balance between some of the more traditional and more contemporary members. The traditional ones tend to be the ones that see it more as a sanctuary. Contemporary ones, they need more of a focus on diversity and a focus on interests that they may share. Second, close friendships. A lot of people had friends that brought them into the lodge. That was one of the reasons they were there. And other people developed close friendships within the lodge. And it would be good to, ideally, to have both, so that you have that social connection to the lodge. In a similar way, you have what you see as a positive social involvement factor is close family ties in the lodge. This was one of the things that got a lot of people into the lodge in the first place, if they had a father, grandfather, other relatives in the lodge. Worked the other way too. Sometimes women would have, spouses would have members of their family that were in the lodge. This would encourage a husband or a partner to get involved. But close family ties, close friendships, this adds another layer or another bond to the organization beyond just being initiated. Beyond this, there needed to be good fellowship. There needed to be like a good social activity, good social connections in the lodge. And there needed to be there was a strong preference here expressed for welcoming new members. And especially, don't let people stand alone. You should try to develop these personal connections with these new members through shared, relevant, and enjoyable social activities for them and their families, things that are relevant to them. And it wasn't just them, it was also involving their families, because things have changed a little bit, and sometimes there needs to be more of a focus on other members of the family to encourage involvement. Fourth, there needed to be an emphasis. There was a positive factor socially, was an emphasis on providing attention and recognition to members. And this occurred in a number of different ways. First of all, when it was seen as due, when a person had, for example, been a member for a long time and they got a 50-year jewel, or if they became master and they got their past master's jewel when they moved on after serving in their term. But the idea is, if people had done something, they contribute to the organization, there needed to be attention to them. In another way, there needed to be what I call quasi-altruistic attention. That's when brethren are having a difficult time, when they need support in some way or another. They're going through the unemployment or a divorce, or they're struggling with alcohol or something like that. Having brethren that they can lean upon, that can be that person that they could talk to or share their issues with, this was seen as very important. And then there were other instances where people would be treated with extraordinary attention. They thought it was almost shocking, almost undeserved. I can think of one fellow who was more or less functionally illiterate, okay, and he didn't have very, very high self-esteem. And the brethren in his lodge kind of helped him move up. They helped him with everything he did. He became master. He was put in the chair, and he thought that it was extraordinary that someone like him could be helped all the way through. And he found it very, very meaningful. And he was very deeply committed to the lodge because these brethren, they raised him up and helped him in ways that he didn't even think he deserved initially. But at the end of it, he was very, very profoundly moved by it. And so these extraordinary, meaningful gestures can sometimes be very helpful. Another thing that came up in terms of social involvement was a membership that was carefully balanced in terms of equality and status, such that there was a healthy and productive tension between internal and external reference of equality and status. People wanted to meet on the level. Yes, they wanted to feel equal in the lodge. But at the same time, sometimes they'd like to feel equal to people who were of higher social status than them. And if there was too much of a focus on status, if it got to be too much, this sort of was seen as undercutting the sort of brotherhood norm. It could be fruitful to a point, but it couldn't be pushed too far where there became feelings of elitism and stuff like that, which didn't exactly help. Finally, a thing that really jumped out was the existence of what I call a reverse onus of social bonding and trust. That this was developed through working together, brethren working together to engage in meaningful activities, pursuing valued goals, working together, and putting a normative emphasis on what is shared, what we all have in common. And this culminates in the development of a Masonic identity. And I just think of one, there's a number of examples I can give, but I think of one fellow who said, you know, I trust these brethren, you know, I'd leave my wallet in this room and walk out of the room with all these guys here, and that would be fine. But the idea was that people felt that if someone was a Mason, they could be less suspicious of them. They could be more trusting. It was almost like the onus reversed, such that they didn't have to feel the questioning about this person. And this kind of bond or connection between people, this bond of trust that seemed to be a little more readily engaged among Masons, or at least they felt that way. This was also something that was seen as a positive social involvement factor. Turn now to the downside of the same dimension. A lodge that undermines long-term involvement is characterized by, in many ways, the opposite of what I've just talked about. So there's, first of all, we talk about the poor fit between members' prior background and the social atmosphere of the lodge, whether measured in terms of people's interests that just aren't in sync, whether it's relevant to their lives in some way, or if they had ideas about what they were going to be joining when they got into the lodge, and they didn't find it borne out in practice. Sometimes these are people that join for social networking reasons, you know, to facilitate their business or their sales. Sometimes it could be other things, but you know, sometimes people get very involved in the cloak and dagger and all these conspiracy theories and stuff, and then they find that the lodge is not what they thought it was. It wasn't this, and sometimes their expectations were not met, and that didn't really keep them around very long. And rather than maintain a fruitful balance in these various ways, this lodge is in some ways out of sync. It doesn't become a sanctuary away from the world for people, but instead it becomes a burden, a meaningless obligation it becomes more than anything else. This is made worse by the fact that a person may have no close friendships in the lodge before joining, and they may not develop them once they get there. There's no family connections, so you got that other layer of bonding that's not there, and none of this is helped by the fact that the social activities, the fellowship, is really not well organized. Where there's few social events, members aren't made to feel welcome at them. They're left alone. They're ignored. They're left out of the loop by cliques that seem to run everything. And there's often sort of perfunctory kind of formal interactions that are all characterized by a feeling of insincerity and people are just going through the motions. You know, it's become ritualistic, but not in the best sense. More in the Robert Burton sense of ritualism as a form of deviance, because it's just felt as something that going through the motions. Okay. Another negative factor: little or sometimes negative attention and recognition. This could take the form of ignoring people, leaving them standing alone, or in especially those cases where members feel criticized about, you know, doing their ritual work, maybe not quite as well as some might think, and you have people kind of, you know, the comments from the peanut gallery, the nitpicking, the criticism, in sort of this sort of perfectionistic kind of mode, and that kind of attention is not the kind of attention that keeps people around. Also, a problem socially is an imbalance of emphasis on status, whether in relation to the people's external status in the outside community, or with reference to the internal system of rank within Masonry. And this, in many ways, is related to what we see are professionalization or workplace models sort of being grafted onto Masonry, and all of this gives people a feel when this emphasis on status gets too out of hand. There's a breach between the rhetoric of equality and the apparent hypocrisy of those climbing this alternate status hierarchy in the minds of the people that are deciding whether they're going to stay or whether they're going to go. And lastly, negative factor, of course, would be social divisions. You know, divisions between on the basis of age, for example, generation gaps, or divisions, you know, politically, ethnically. There's all kinds of things that can come up, and this is worse when there's few shared activities between different groups, as well as negative interactions. You know, there may be people not behaving ethically, people trying to advance their own interests, and this will result. This kind of perceiving this kind of thing can result in little social bonding, where then in this reverse onus trust is certainly not going to grow in that kind of situation. And this basically represents when there's social divisions, when there's problems, you know, unethical behavior, nepotism, criticism, personal conflicts. This doesn't encourage the inculcation of the Masonic identity, and neither does it encourage involvement. Turn now to organizational factors. This is the other major area in which we see respondents commenting about the craft. Now, the ideal lodge that will encourage involvement is characterized by the following things. First of all, you have a membership, an existing membership that's productively balanced between bringing in enough members to offset attrition and efforts to involve and retain current members. There's the issue of secrecy and openness, which pertains to recruitment and the activities of the lodge, and then the emphasis on quantity versus quality. But there needs to be a balance. Like there's a range of opinions about all of this. But in terms of membership policy, some say, well, bring in large number of members. You know, sometimes do these one-day classes like they do in some places. And even if we keep a small fraction, we're still going to have a larger membership than if we did the traditional secrecy route when it comes to attracting members. And there, the idea is to bring in quantity to keep numbers up. Others say, well, no, we don't want quantity, we want quality. We want to go with the traditional secrecy in recruitment as opposed to being open and looking for large numbers. We want quality, not quantity. And the debate continues, but there needs to still be enough focus on bringing members in, but also on doing things in a quality way. Secondly, there needs to be a dues structure of sufficient cost to emphasize the importance and status of Masonry. One of the comments I heard quite a few times was, we sell Masonry too cheap. Okay, and the idea is that there's been efforts to keep dues low for decades, but it hasn't stopped the attrition problem, so maybe that's not the solution. Some places have put in place fairly substantial fees for initiation and to maintain your membership, and others say, well, you know, then people will dispute that and say, well, you know, not everybody can afford that. So it's been pointed out that there's a Prince Hall jurisdiction that has lodges that have fairly high dues to really bring those people in. You know, they pay a lot, they're going to value it, but at the same time, it's possible for lodges in those jurisdictions, other ones that have fairly affordable dues, and of course people can visit from one lodge to the next. So the idea is to have a due structure that's going to cover things for everybody, bring people in, but at the same time make it affordable for those that need that. Third, the brethren need to be able to participate in the business of the lodge immediately after receiving their first degree. So there has been a history of lodges not allowing people to participate or anything until they got their third degree, and that meant for a long time lag sometimes. In more recent years, there's been a push to allow everybody to participate after getting their first degree, and this certainly is going to engage people a lot more quickly. Fourth, there's the issue of how people get involved in offices. And it's been pointed out that leaders need to be tactful in this, you know, in how they approach things. You know, not so much the arm twisting sort of thing. Sometimes brethren are reluctant, and there needs to be some encouragement to become involved. But people also have to be supported along the way, and they have to be told that they'll be supported. This will be better at facilitating their willingness to take part. I can't say enough about number 5, which is a strong emphasis on the lodge experience itself, as opposed to things like Grand Lodge and stuff like that. It's a number of people said they really want to have a quality experience when they go out to a meeting. This means good content in the meeting, efficient meeting management by the master, as well as various accoutrements of exclusivity, you know, like making it, testing visitors, making sure that there's things that make people feel that they're part of an exclusive club, whether in terms of the clothes, the regalia, and whatever. But the idea is to make people feel it's something special. And I will say that one of the things that stood out more than anything else here was, don't make it all a business meeting. Just don't, okay? Don't hide behind the minutes and the accounts and that sort of thing, and don't provide any content for the brethren, because otherwise they don't feel like there's any reason to go. They find it boring. And one person said to me succinctly, he says, well, I can pay my own bills at home. Why am I going out for this? You know, getting all dressed up, going downtown for half an hour to watch people pay bills. So the behind a cookie cutter trestle board and doing minutes accounts and all that sort of thing, because it's just going to bore people and it's not going to make them want to stay involved. Number 6, people express the need to have encounters, have the lodge actively involved and interact with the wider community. Oftentimes in terms of charity, do work, and having brethren from the lodge work together on a common project, work together for a common goal. To be open that this is in fact a Masonic activity and a charity, to get good public relations, and essentially try to integrate the lodge in various forms of community involvement, to show the flag, to show what Freemasons are, who they are, what they do. Positive organization, of course, would have no conflict, no contentious dynamics within the lodge, which turn people off. And the lodge should have a strong ability to solve and cope with these problems when they emerge, rather than let them fester and get out of hand. 8th, there needs to be a good supportive relationship with the Grand Lodge, reflective of accessibility, a sense that lodges are being heard, and that it's possible to get things done, coupled again with a productive balance between equality and status. 9th, because there have been some issues over the last few decades about the relationship with the lodge and the shrine, particularly in terms of the membership requirements of joining the shrine have changed, and a number of concordant bodies were upset about this, and there was some thought that they might even decouple their membership from the craft lodges. Anyway, there's having a good relationship with the shrine, not letting shrine politics come over into lodge. This will help as well. And lastly, there needs to be a generational balance where there's a good relationship between younger and older members. Because there's been concern that there's a generation gap, largely because of the so-called lost generation of the 60s, when a lot of the boomers didn't join the craft. And this meant that you have a lot of older members, and then there was this slight uptick around the turn of the 21st century and beyond in younger members. But oftentimes, because of the generational differences, it was difficult for brethren to sometimes relate to one another. And you know, there's this feeling that the older fellows just kept doing things the way they always did and hogged all the offices. And meanwhile, the older people thought, well, we're doing all the heavy lifting. We're doing the work of the lost generation. There needs to be developed a lodge that is going to be positive, has a good generational balance, good working relationship between younger and older members. There needs to be a productive division of labor between the two, as opposed to people holding on to offices for too long. And there needed to be a sense of mutual input and respect so that both sides feel heard. On the other hand, if you're talking about the downside of things, an organizationally problematic lodge, at least in terms of involvement, has many of the opposite traits. First of all, an ineffective membership policy, the one that doesn't bring in enough members to offset attrition, and it doesn't effectively re-engage existing members that maybe haven't been coming out for a while. It's often characterized by an imbalance between secrecy and openness, such that you don't have the balance between the older method of bringing people in through being more secretive and sort of encourage them through, you know, little hints and stuff like that, to being completely wide open. One approach works better for one group, one works better for another. You need to have a balance there. If you go too far in one direction or the other, it might not be as productive. You need to stress, you shouldn't just stress quantity over quality. You need to have a strong emphasis on both. Your dues structure should not sell masonry too cheap, which means that, you know, if you don't pay much for something, you don't value it. There needs to be something more involved. It needs to be more meaningful to you. And if you're going to spend a lot of money for it, you're going to want something in return. You won't allow members to, a negative lodge won't allow members to attend and take part until after they have their third degree, putting in place a big gap in time, which may find them losing interest. A negative lodge will have few brethren willing to take part. There's a lot of arm twisting involved to take offices. Once people are in office, there's lack of support for officers. This results in poor ritual work. It's coupled with poor administrative leadership on the part of the master and treasurer and secretary, you're going to ultimately end up with burnout. You have too few people taking on too many responsibilities, and it all comes apart after a while. Negative organization. One big negative factor is, again, boring, poorly managed business meetings, all based on the workplace model, extensive bureaucratization, an emphasis on external issues such as Grand Lodge as opposed to the lodge itself, focusing on minutiae such as, should we spend $50 to buy flowers for this person, or how much is the dinner going to cost if we have a dinner? All of this provides members a disconnect with the reading. This is not the kind of stuff you read about when you read about Masonry. It also, in many ways, contrasts with Masonic teachings, as well as members' expectations and understandings of what the craft is all about. If you focus on this kind of stuff, it's just going to be, this is not what I expected. Negative lodges also have few, if any, interactions with the wider community, have a more focused insular emphasis on the group, and this does not really show the flag. It doesn't help get members. Negative lodge will deal with a lot of conflict. There'd be a lot of contentious dynamics over various issues, infighting over hot button issues. Conflict drives people away. Eighth, a poor relationship with Grand Lodge, basically, especially in relation to feeling that it's overly bureaucratized. There's a lot of micromanaging. Also, if there's a problematic, unresponsive administrative structure in the lodge, as well as contentious perceptions of elitism in the lodge that are seen as out of sync with today's more egalitarian social ethos. There's also, if there might be problematic connections with the shrine or shrine politics spilling over into the lodge. And last, either an aging, declining membership that's just not being replaced, or demographic generational divisions. If it is the latter, that there's a generation gap, this may involve older members resisting change, claiming that they're doing all the work and gradually dying off, while younger members at the same time see them as an obstacle to advancement in programming that could be much more culturally relevant to today's Masons. And so this creates sort of a contentious dynamic in some cases, or at least it means that things don't work together, as generations, older and younger people, don't work together as well as they could, and this also turns people off. I turn now to the issue of education. there's a lot of talk about education in the interviews, and a lodge that facilitates member involvement in this area of respect is characterized by three things. First, good, relevant mentoring of candidates. That's both informally by the people who propose people to be members of the lodge, but also more formally through mentoring programs. So this let's just say that there's a lot of programs out there. Sometimes they're not implemented as consistently as they could. Sometimes there's not enough people to do the things that need to be done, and this is something that needs to be should be sorted out fairly right up front. Secondly, that you need a lodge that facilitates member involvement. Doesn't just educate people through mentoring. It also means that a relatively high proportion of brethren essentially learn on the job, if you will. They learn by doing, whether this is through just simply taking an office, performing their part in the ritual, maybe conducting more personal research on Masonry in line with their interests, or in some cases be willing to give interesting educational talks and presentations. And again, just by doing that, they learn. If you have enough brethren that are willing to do this kind of thing, this is also going to facilitate education. Finally, there need to be proper educational initiatives that bridge the gap between the end of the mentoring process that are in the formal programs that are put forward by various Grand Lodges. You need something that bridges the gap between the end of mentoring and those brethren who formally learn by doing. And this involves focusing attention on members that are involved in neither of these things. It would help to target uninvolved brethren through checking what their interests are, screening them even for prior interests, and then individual brethren may help provide informal venues for sharing common issues and topics in a more relaxed, convivial, social atmosphere. Sometimes this kind of thing just simply can't be done in lodge. And I'm thinking of two groups that I was aware of that did something like this that was very productive in terms of membership. One involved a group of brethren in the Scottish jurisdiction in Newfoundland. There's two jurisdictions there for those that don't know. The Grand Lodge of Scotland has a district Grand Lodge there, and the Grand Lodge of Newfoundland and Labrador took over what used to be the old Grand Lodge, District Grand Lodge of England. So there's actually two jurisdictions in Newfoundland, and I've had dealings with both. And some of the Scottish brethren I knew, they'd get together outside of lodge, and they would meet at one of the brethren's place. They were all musicians. They'd get together and play their instruments, sit around, have some drinks, and they'd talk about Masonic issues. Sometimes they'd complain about what was going on in the lodge, but there was a lot of discussion, and this was very meaningful to these people. They found it one of the things that really supplemented and helped their experience in lodge. Similarly, I'm aware, simply because I was involved in it myself, of a thing that emerged whereby members of a number of different lodges who had members that are at the university, a group of us started getting together just sort of informally for a beer on Friday afternoon at the campus pub. And after a while, this grew and grew and grew and became sort of a discussion group. We'd socialize, and this group basically brought so many new members into the lodge that we actually ended up forming our own lodge. And this was something that just fell on us. We didn't look for it. It happened. It was one of these sort of organically sort of developing social venues that was very, very Masonic, and it was fruitful in terms of membership and, for that matter, keeping some of the members that we had after we formed the lodge. So it's good to have these informal venues to share common issues, common topics regarding Masonry in a relaxed social atmosphere. You can't force this kind of thing, and you can't make it too bureaucratic. It's something that develops organically. The lodge is just a facilitator, or it could be a clearinghouse for this, but it's useful to have these kind of supplementary activities, if you call them that. But lodges that undermine involvement don't do these things. First of all, proposers and other brethren don't provide any informal mentoring. Formal programs are non-existent, or they're poorly implemented, and there's a lot of stress on just getting the candidates through your third degree so you can shove them into an office. Other things that undermine involvement, learning by doing is not a good thing. Rather, it's sort of a baptism of fire where people are forced into a role or have their arm twisted into a role, and then they're not supported by the other brethren. And then meanwhile, they're criticized for not doing things right by the peanut gallery. This also doesn't help. And lastly, with regard to education, if a lodge that doesn't check or screen what people's interests are, and doesn't provide, and there's no informal venues to share common issues or topics, that's a problem. In these lodges, if Masonic education exists at all, it either consists of boring, monotone lectures on a very arcane subject that interest very few, or what's more often the case, members that have an interest in Masonic issues, they're left to learn essentially on their own. And not all are motivated to do that. So having a supportive educational environment also facilitates involvement in these various ways that I've described. This brings us to the other activities and involvement of that members have. And of course, the idea is that if you're involved in a whole bunch of other things, you don't have time to be involved in Masonry. So ideal typical lodges, those that seem to do well, are characterized by a complementary relationship between their activities and programs and members' other commitments and involvements. Okay, so their members, the lodges that do well, members have relatively few other social involvements, activities, or commitments, or they have experienced support, or at least a degree of indifference for their Masonic activities from others in their social group. And both members and their associates were either supportive of the traditional male-only gender policy, or at least they're willing to make some kind of accommodation. These lodges also exhibited a willingness to creatively accommodate members' other commitments, involvements, and orientations in a fruitful way. On the other hand, lodges that had difficulties had basically put on activities and engaged in interests that gave them, the people had a lot of other things on the go, and they really had very little time to be involved in Masonry. Maybe they have kids, maybe their wife doesn't want them involved, maybe they travel in their work, they're very involved in other activities, they just haven't got the time to be involved. And members have a lot of other involvements that give them little time to commit. Such lodges also have to deal with the opposition to member involvement, sometimes from significant others like spouses, family members, friends, religious leaders, or even others in members' social context that basically they were opposed. Their Masonic involvement was opposed. And there's just no way to creatively address this opposition. In fact, the men-only membership policy in mainstream information was not only seen as problematic by some, but it also was seen as problematic, especially by younger members, as it was seen as reducing the legitimacy of their involvement in participants' eyes. So this is an issue that should be that really needs to be considered. This brings us to moral, ethical matters. And people did raise some issues regarding morality. Ideal typical lodges are seen by their members as providing moral and ethical benefits. The phrase in Masonry is to make good men better. And this is often relates to morality. Such lodges are seen by members as providing for them a firm foundation, a moral haven in some ways, in relation to the way society has, in the eyes of some, gone down the tubes. This is all seen as beneficial to people's character, fostering self-improvement, and fostering a Masonic identity as well. Morality is in many ways seen as the hallmark of a Mason, and this is seen, if it improves that sort of thing, it certainly can be helpful. On the other hand, less than ideal lodges, those that drive people away, as it were, are seen as falling considerably short of this ideal moral image by their members. It preaches a lot of morality, but people may perceive the lodge, members of the lodge, of being hypocrites, being involved in nepotism, or other type of unethical behavior. This is not the kind of thing that encourages people to stick around. It doesn't certainly contribute to a positive Masonic identity, to say the least. Lastly, brethren talked about motivation. An ideal typical lodge that's going to foster involvement is going to build upon a member's original curiosity to join, and it will serve to diversify their motivations over time, at times providing unforeseen benefits. And one of the things I'm saying here is that sometimes people are motivated to join for a particular reason, but that may not be the reason over time that they stick around. There may be provided new reasons once they are involved. Motivations change, and the lodge has to be attentive to changing motivations, changing interests. This kind of lodge that motivates, helps motivate brethren, strategically diversifies and balances the activities and programs to provide a broader range of productive motivations. These serves as resources for members and resources for their involvement. So you need to balance, for example, in this respect, between younger and older members, new members, and seasoned volunteers. This lodge at the same time positions itself well for, people's changing motivations over time, because it provides a range of different motivations or interests or things for people to be involved in. On the other hand, lodges that are problematic in this respect don't do anything to build on members' original motivations. They don't kindle new ones once the members arrive there either. In this kind of lodge, leaders don't strategically diversify their activities and their programs in any kind of balanced fashion. This means that they can't sufficiently meet people's changing motivations, such that they undermine members' original motivations, while others that they might have encouraged them to stay are ultimately stillborn. Okay, so before closing, I just have a few final observations I want to make to kind of hit on some important matters with some of these themes. First of all, I thought a lot of what I've talked about here can be usefully conceptualizing using Travis Hershey's model of bonding. Now, this is an approach that was originally formulated in relation to criminology, but it talks about the kind of bonds that we have that prevent us from engaging in deviant behavior. In this case, I conceptualize deviance as leaving in this situation. But basically, Hershey argues that we have to strongly believe in what an organization stands for. We have to retain an attachment to it. In other words, that's the degree to which individuals are sensitive to the expectations of others in the group. People need to feel attached to how other people think of them in the group. They need to be committed. In Hershey's terms, that means that the time and the energy you put into this line of activity might be put at risk or lost if you leave. So if people are committed, they've put a lot of time and effort into it, and they don't want to lose that. And then involvement, in Hershey's sense, this means that the extent to which time and energy are used up by non-group pursuits limits time for the group, people being involved in the group itself. So my argument is, if you have belief, attachment, commitment, involvement at relatively high levels, this not only promotes long-term membership, but it also promotes a Masonic identity. On the other hand, where the people don't believe in the organization, they don't feel an attachment to other people's opinions of them within the group, they don't have extensive lines of activity that they're afraid of losing if they leave, and they don't have a lot of let's just say there's this issue of involvement as well. That can lead to basically leaving when these factors are not strong. Secondly, lodges need to address the changing sort of external social context that society, represented by society today. And in this sense, what we need are a recognition that the world is different than it was back, say, in the 50s, when you had a patriarchal environment. Usually the husband worked and his leisure activities were his own. All right. There weren't as many other competing social activities such as we see today. So the idea here is that we live in an uncertain sort of work environment for a lot of people. We need to consider the changing work-life balance that is often a challenge today. We have to consider the changing gender relations, and we also have to basically considered the kind of recreational activities that a lot of people engage in today. We need to consider this changing social contact, and we need to more or less orient the lodge to this sort of new environment. We need to, and for that matter, there needs to be a fruitful balance between traditionalists that are seeking the lodge. One person called it conservatives looking for a place to be. You need to fruitfully balance between these traditionalists, both older members as well as younger members that are attracted for that reason. People that are seeking sanctuary in the lodge, and you have to seek those, and you need to balance that with those more younger generations, those people that are entering the craft now that seek relevance of the lodge to the external culture and so on, because often it's a bit of a culture shock for younger people. So you need to have a balance between this traditionalist attraction as well as people who are seeking relevance with relation to masonry in more external terms. Then there's the issue of status and equality. This came up in a number of different contexts. While Masonic ritual and the structure of offices, the level and system of honorary titles contain elements of both equality and status, there appear to be problems when these aren't carefully balanced. While status attainment can contribute to involvement, whether we're talking about this in terms of the economy of attention and recognition, the emphasis on Grand Lodge as opposed to the lodge experience, motivation, or other variables, the data show that an alternate status hierarchy can be both productive and destructive to member involvement if not carefully balanced. Further, given the fact that today's society has a much more egalitarian ethos than in the past, as well as recruits fewer members of higher social rank, the balance has to be set differently than in the days where titles, social rank, and deference to authority were the social norm. Lodges that don't recognize this and adapt and adhere uncritically to the way that's always been done, they risk perpetuating a maladaptive, imbalanced approach that increasingly risks alienating rank and file members. Next, many of the issues I've talked about could be related to the demographics of the lodges today. Given that the so-called lost generation of the baby boomers largely didn't become involved in masonry, many of the factors that I've talked about are made worse by cultural differences between generations. Social activities, running meetings, styles of education, motivations, moralities, and understandings surrounding other commitments and involvement often mean very different things to younger and older Masons, who in some cases fail to understand each other, and the lodge bleeds members from either deaths or demits. Constructive ways need to be found to bridge this gap, particularly in urban areas where it's most notable, in order to bump up long-term involvement for those who will be the future of the craft. Finally, in all these respects, there's a need to consider the important principle of balance. Lodges today should respect the Masonic landmarks, yet be willing to shake off the restrictive incrustations and of these unnecessary traditions, often premised with the words, "This is how we've always done it here." Rather than perpetuate the bureaucratic business model, it's itself largely a development reflective of the mid-20th century focus on big business and organized philanthropy. Lodges today need to be nimble. They need to be adaptive, better able to balance necessary traditions with a rapidly changing society. Keeping an eye on the original broad Masonic ideal of self-improvement, they must balance attention to the various motivations for joining and those that emerge later. They need to balance equality and status, young and old, Masonic culture and culture at large. They must balance business and ritual for all, with greater emphasis on informal, convivial groupings of shared interests. Ultimately, the factors that I've noted here have to be considered in light of members' social context today. Maintaining a fruitful tension between status and equality, the need to facilitate productive engagement between generations, and the need to carefully balance involvement initiatives on several dimensions. In effect, to encourage involvement in lodges today, lodges need to break out of the restrictive bindings of the past, and within the landmarks to get input and experiment to see what works for their membership and what doesn't, to facilitate both the growth of Hershey's social bonds and a strong set of Masonic identities among their members. Because let's face it, we're in a society where the identity is a big focus. And so why not a Masonic one? So there needs to be a pragmatic willingness to use the working tools provided to try once, to try again, and to see what works to build the temple in today's society. That's what's needed. This is the Freemasonry of the future. Thank you.